The first rumor about the quiet prisoner circled through the stone corridors of the royal keep the way cool water finds the hairline cracks in baked earth. Without hurry, without drama, but always forward, always deeper. He had arrived iron-ankled and dry-lipped, yet not broken. By the next sunrise the guards had begun to notice the way he rose before even the wicket lamps died, how he knelt on the hard clay floor and whispered verses whose cadence held the hush of wind over wheat. Someone said the words came from the Qur'an. Someone else hissed that no book could survive in a place that chewed paper as eagerly as it chewed men. Yet by afternoon the rumor had grown its own vine of fascination, and that was when the warden began to fear imperceptible rebellion. In the upper cells, where petty embezzlers waited for bribes to ferment, men questioned whether such calm was merely the arrogance of an educated thief. Farther down, in the darkness that smelled of rust and wet straw, two condemned servants argued in whispers about whether the stranger was a prophet or a fraud. One was the royal cupbearer, a young man who could still taste the tang of pomegranates in the memory of his last banquet. The other had poured wine too greedily into his own veins and now served the same sentence as his deeds, a vintner by craft, a prisoner by consequence. Like many who wake to find dignity torn away, they were ready to anchor their fear in any solid myth. The corridor lamps guttered. Rats performed the slow ballet that rats perform when they believe they are unobserved. More than once an old decree, folded into a lamp for kindling, slipped free and fell burning onto the floor, illuminating the dirt like a fallen star. During one of those accidental auroras the cupbearer looked through the bars and saw the newcomer sitting cross-legged, eyes half closed, palms face up. Not praying now, simply breathing as though mapping the distances of some internal cartography. Something in that stillness defeated the dank air, a small breach of light. When asked later what he had felt, the cupbearer used a single word he had not employed since childhood: clarity. That single word migrated through the ward. Clarity. It tasted foreign to men whose tomorrow was a fog that might contain a pardon, but more likely contain nothing. The notion that a man could see anything clearly behind bars insulted their common suffering, yet they craved it the way thirsty men crave the sight of clouds. The jailer, who fancied himself immune to trivia, nevertheless paused the next day while distributing the coarse barley bread. If you need ink and parchment, he told the stranger, ask. Prophets draft revolutions, and I would rather see handwriting than fire. The stranger smiled with that difficult gentleness which both blesses and rebukes. He asked for nothing. For days later the dreams began. The cupbearer dreamt that a vine burst from the cracks of the cell floor, shoulders of green pushing aside the dust. 3 branches, each jeweled with clusters of translucent grapes, rose until they brushed the ceiling. He placed the king's goblet beneath a ripened cluster, squeezed, and watched crimson flow like dusk made liquid. When he looked up again, the stranger stood on the other side of the bars, nodding. That same night, in the next alcove, the winemaker, now prisoner like the rest, dreamt of 3 baskets balanced on his head, white bread rising warm as sunlight. Birds descended, ash-gray and eager, stabbing their beaks through the loaves until crumbs rained onto his shoulders. He tried to wave them off, but his arms were plastered to his sides, as if tied by invisible rope. From somewhere behind the feathered cloud the stranger watched, silent. They awoke, gasping, eyes bright in darkness. By dawn they had agreed on courage. They would ask him, not because they fully trusted him, but because terror leaves little room for skepticism. One either leaps or withers at the cliff's edge. He listened without interrupting, head tilted like a reader aligning columns of poetry in his mind. When they finished, the cupbearer looked away, ashamed at how thin his voice had sounded. The winemaker clenched the bars that separated them, as though wanting to wring out the verdict before it could curdle. The quiet prisoner spoke, the words inhaling and exhaling certainty. You, he said to the cupbearer, shall serve wine again to the sovereign. 3 branches, 3 days. Life will sprout unexpectedly, and you will rise with it. Remember, when you stand close to power once more, that all grace belongs to Allah. Remember me, also, when you are free, and mention my case before the throne. Turning to the winemaker, his voice gentled, as though cushioning the blow that no pillow could soften. You, he said, will be lifted also, but not into freedom, The same birds you saw will feast on your flesh beneath an open sky. 3 baskets, 3 days. The winemaker collapsed. The cupbearer swallowed a guilty joy that tasted like theft. The stranger's sentence contained no hesitation. It had the weight of rain-heavy cloud that must fall because gravity is a species of obedience. The news of the dual prophecy whirled through the prison like sparked straw. Even the fat spider that nested between the torches seemed to pause, as though time itself wanted to honor the compression of future into speech. Stillness is a rare perfume underground, and for a night the air was thick with it. Day 1 passed in the burdened slowness that precedes a shift in weather. Day 2 arrived bright and strange. The jailer hummed. Day 3 erupted. At noon, guards dragged the winemaker away. At twilight, another squad fetched the cupbearer, though gently, like a tool they intended to reuse. The whispers proved accurate. A royal celebration required trusted hands. The condemned man returned only as rumor, and soon even rumor ossified. The cupbearer rode back to privilege on the wings of a promise the prisoner had forged from vision. History always advances conglomerates of stories, but sometimes it pauses, pivoting from multitude to single narrative because a certain narrative decides to reach toward it. Chroniclers would later cite trade imbalances, harvest cycles, and the peculiar psychology of pharaohs to explain what happened next. They would ignore the slipperiness of human memory, how it hoards what is convenient and misplaces what is costly. Meanwhile, the quiet prisoner remained, counting neither days nor seasons, only the pulses of breath that strung his prayers together. To describe lingering is to describe a silence shaped like yearning. It is the taste of dates you can see but cannot reach. It is the mathematics of hope, a function that declines yet never intersects zero. Months dissolved. The moon rehearsed her own cycles of captivity above the courtyard, and every time her scimitar version appeared, the prisoner of clarity offered the same confession. That faith is a rope whose fibers might fray but never sever, because it is handwoven by God himself. Outside, politics danced its usual grim choreographies. Alliances bartered, harvest forecasts argued over, astrologers promoted, counselors dismissed. The monarch's dreams began to curdle, sprouting images that even the professional interpreters, who could read auguries in the skid of an owl's shadow, fled from. The king needed a lucid mind. The rumor of such a mind had once traversed dungeon hallways, then prison gates, and should have now been lifted to court. But rumor is a blunt instrument until sharpened by necessity. Remembering is a kind of resurrection. At dawn, while dew daubed the palace gardens like punctuation in a sonnet, the cupbearer asked for permission to speak and told his story, beginning with the vine that erupted from stone. He spoke of 3 days that divided despair from restoration, naming the prisoner who had perceived geometry in dreams. The king's eyes narrowed, not in doubt but calculation. "Fetch him," he commanded, terse as stone striking flint. Yet the prison gates did not swing open at once. The counselor of dreams, this Yusuf, son of Yaqub, would not return to the world on a whim, because whims are veins of ego, and his liberation could not be mined from ego. He requested that the cupbearer first revisit the allegations that had shackled him years earlier. Justice must be awakened, he insisted, not merely set free. The king, surprised but intrigued, summoned the accusers. Truth, when it finally surfaced, blew apart the thin ice of sin like a warm tide under moonlight. Only then did Yusuf step into sunlit air, his first day's breath outside captivity, tasting of persimmon and responsibility. The prison behind him swallowed its own gloom. The story might have ended here had it been scripted by lesser authors. But the Qur'an teaches that providence writes longer arcs. Harvests still needed saving, empires still needed steering, and forgiveness, most improbable of fruits, still needed ripening. That is how the rumor of a quiet prisoner became the counsel of a prime minister, how the geometry of dreams translated into public policy, and how, beneath the glare of desert noon, an entire kingdom learned that clarity is not the opposite of pain, but its womb. Silence has many dialects. In palaces, it speaks through the hush before a verdict. In deserts, it speaks through the belly of night when the dunes rustle like sequins on an invisible cloak. Yusuf had learned them all, yet the hush that greeted him on his first morning in office felt newer than any prison quiet, for it was tempered by permission to choose, permission to fail. permission to steer a nation away from the edge of its own hunger. He walked the limestone colonnade toward the council chamber flanked by sistrum-bearing heralds, their bronze instruments chiming an offbeat rhythm that seemed too bright for dawn. The air smelled of lotus and parchment ink. The latter would soon record what the Qur'an would memorialize in fewer, sharper strokes: 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and the mathematics of mercy that braided them. The pharaoh, shoulders draped in lapis cloth, greeted him not as a felon pardoned, but as a surgeon summoned. "Tell me of the cows and corn," he murmured, repeating the infection that had festered in his dreams. His voice held the brittleness of a man who has slept poorly for too many nights. Yusuf answered in images rather than counsel first, because cure requires an accurate diagnosis, describing how the dream's 7 sated cows were devoured by 7 emaciated ones, how lush stalks of wheat surrendered to withered stubble, how the river itself seemed to thin. He translated vision into arithmetic, a table of crop yields, a calendar of rainfall patterns the astrologers had kept but misread, an unseen ledger of human appetites. When he finished, the throne room resonated with the cold echo of data. Proposals followed like scaffolding rising around an idea. Granaries expanded beyond city walls, reservoirs dredged and sealed with pitch, quotas set on the harvest, a tax levied not on coin but on complacency. "Store a fifth," Yusuf said, "not as tyrants hoard gold, but because God's kindness postpones the test, not cancels it." Some ministers frowned. They preferred miracles without ledgers, mercy without labor. Yet suspicion tugged at respect. The stranger had seen past and future with equal accuracy. Perhaps he saw economy too. Sign tablets were dispatched across the floodplain by nightfall. Pliny loves to be mistaken for permanence. For 6 years the Nile fattened like a festival ox, disgorging topsoil so rich you could smell iron in it after rain. Water wheels squealed like songbirds. Children in riverside villages learned to swim by stroking between emerald reeds taller than their fathers. Storehouses mushroomed, domed silos of adobe and cedar, sealed with bitumen, guarded by night watchmen who sang under their breath the lunar verses Yusuf had taught them. Inscribed on lintels in both hieroglyph and flowing Arabic script was a fragment of Surah 12, and Allah is the best of planners. Scholars later argued whether such bilingual piety helped or hindered efficiency, but even cynics noted an unquantifiable serenity within the project's massive logistics. On the 7th year the river hesitated. It arrived thin and late, muttering through reeds that had grown brittle. Farmers knelt, fingering the mud like physicians reading a weakened pulse. Sky and wind and cracked clay began their slow conspiracy, each sunrise removing another small certainty. In the council hall Yusuf unrolled maps marked with charcoal rings, village names now surrounded by a color-coded dread. "Begin release," he ordered, and grain moved down canals on barges that sailed like lumbering camels of the delta. Ration ledgers replaced harvest ledgers. What had once been surplus became doctrine. Merchants bartered not in price but in weight. Priests prayed to heaven but noticed the earthly granaries remained open, and Pharaoh's insomnia eased for the first time in months. Yet scarcity ripples beyond borders faster than charity can swim. Caravans from Canaan began appearing like ghosts at dawn gates, their beasts gaunt, their saddlebags loose. Among them, on a morning lit by a pale half-sun, rode 10 brothers leaving plumes of dust and unspoken guilt behind them. They dismounted before the palace depot, each bearing coins minted during the fat years. The metal felt heavier than shame, yet they carried both. Yusuf watched from a lattice balcony, heart thrumming between betrayal and blessing. Their faces were older, beards streaked with desert iron, but memory extracted the boyish schemers beneath. He could still taste the dry throat of a cistern, still hear their arguments ricocheting off stone walls while he waited for either mercy or the final stone to roll across the gap of sky. Protocol demanded anonymity. Providence demanded a test. Yusuf descended wrapped in ministerial linen, the collar stitched with lapis crescents. He greeted them through an interpreter, his own tongue disguised in diplomatic reserve. They bowed, not recognizing the dreamer grown into the dream's architect. Questions followed: place of origin, livestock counts, the health of their aging father. When they confessed there were 12 reduced to 10 by misfortune and 1 presumed death, Yusuf felt time telescope so abruptly that the floor seemed to tilt. Yet anger did not bloom. What surfaced instead was a stern kind of mercy, the mercy of a surgeon again, incising illusion to heal deeper lesions. He sold them grain at fair price but ordered their payment returned secretly into their sacks, a mirror to unsettle conscience. He detained Simeon to guarantee their return with the youngest, Benjamin, whose absence felt to Yusuf like a missing semitone in a long-held chord. The brothers left perplexed but provisioned, unaware that guilt had slipped into their packs along with the coin. In the night market of avarice, Yusuf watched their caravan shrink into dust, wondering whether restoration was a road walked once or a spiral climbed multiple times, each rotation closer to the same aching center. Weeks unwind quickly within famine zones. Bread loaves shrink by fractions so small that hunger notices before mathematics does. The brothers returned to Canaan, triggered a domestic parliament beneath an aging fig tree, Jacob refusing to lose Benjamin the way the wind steals two leaves at once. Yet grain dwindled, coin weighed conscience, and eventually the patriarch surrendered the youngest, binding their departure with an oath not of survival but of sincerity, as though truth might shelter them where strategies could not. When they re-entered Yusuf's province, the desert seemed to exhale them forward. He received them with formal generosity, seating them by birth order, a trick that made suspicion prickle like static across their spines. Food arrived: roasted fowl, honeyed cucumbers, lentils steeped in coriander. But he heaped Benjamin's plate fivefold, and in the laughter that followed, Yusuf saw his brother's eyes flicker to him with baffled gratitude. Night deepened. Stars pressed against the lattice like anxious candle flames, and Yusuf instructed servants to hide his personal silver gauge, Pharaoh's own measuring chalice, into Benjamin's grain sack. The ambush was calibrated not for revenge but revelation. At dawn, the caravan had barely cleared the first watchtower when mounted guards thundered behind, demanding inspection. The chalice appeared where guilt least belonged: Benjamin's satchel. Accusations, protestations, torn garments. Yusuf watched, silent, while the brothers offered themselves as substitute bondsmen, evidence that regret can mature into nobility when watered by years of remembering. Judah's voice cracked as he spoke of their father's sorrow, the phrase "gray hairs and grief" falling like ash onto the marble floor. Something inside Yusuf bent, then broke. Tears burst past the barricades of caution. He ordered the room cleared of all but kin, and when the last guard closed the cedar doors, the minister of all Egypt wept so loudly that his cry ricocheted through antechambers like bronze cymbals struck in lament. "I am Yusuf," he said in fluent Hebrew, the syllables unlocking a decade of buried names. Silence expanded in the room like an eclipse. The brothers stood paralyzed, as if the very architecture might dissolve should they move. He stepped forward, palms up, showing neither rings of authority nor clenched fist of rage, only the naked honesty of arrival. "Do not fear reproach," he said, quoting the very scripture that had accompanied him down prison corridors. "Indeed, Satan stirs rivalry. Allah has brought me here to preserve life." In those words he bound sovereignty to service and made blame irrelevant, a footnote consumed by the main text of Providence. What followed was as delicate as transplanting a sapling: embrace, apology, the damp heat of forgiveness mingling with the coriander steam that still lingered. They conversed in overlapping memories, stitching torn chronology into contiguous cloth. Outside, palace messengers galloped toward Canaan with word of reunion. Inside, Yusuf drafted logistics for entire familial resettlement: wagons, water rations, diplomatic escorts. The famine still stalked the land, lean as the prophetic cows, but salvation was unfolding as a caravan of elders, children, and livestock traversing a geopolitical chessboard under the guardianship of verse and vision. Evening over Memphis glowed violet, the color of bruised figs at harvest end. Yusuf climbed the granary tower whose shadow he had measured countless times against the sun, the same way a poet measures scansion. From that height he could see the slow drizzle of grain pouring into carts, could hear the distant rhythm of mortars pounding cracked wheat into edible powder, could scent the faint dryness of dust that famine always carried like a watermark on the wind. Yet layered over these senses was a subtler symphony: the hoof thrum of a family returning, the hush of rivers adjusting their course around fate, and somewhere in the airy distance the echo of a boy's voice reciting dreams that had now come to roost like doves on parapets. That night he wrote a letter to his younger self, imaginary, of course, for such letters can be posted only to the heart, explaining that prisons might compress space but never purpose, that betrayal may gouge but cannot deafen the soul to revelation. That Islam's promise of sabr, patience, is not passive endurance but muscular expectation, a stance braced for the miracle already on its way. He folded the letter into the silence, trusting the one who authored both silence and speech to deliver it across time. Tired dawn climbed the horizon, revealing caravans approaching like constellations fallen onto sand. The next tableau would involve fathers and sons, prostrations and garments, a throne and an orchard of reconciled tears. But for now Yusuf stood between warehouse and sky, a man who had tunneled through nightmares into ministry, who had measured grain and guilt alike, who understood that every story is an ecosystem. Famine grows beside abundance, grief beside grace. And only in the mirror of both does the human spirit recognize its own parable. The dust of departure lifts differently when hope precedes it. Each hoofbeat thrums not exile, but a homing song older than geography. When Jacob's household, sons, wives, children, servants, use bleeding as though rehearsing an ancestral chorus, poured out of Hebron's foothills toward Egypt, they left behind more than drought-scarred orchards. They abandoned a long winter of remorse that had frozen even spring rain. Yet remorse, like sap, travels with the wood. Every clop of the caravan seemed to echo the hidden syllables of their former cruelty. The pit, the pit, the pit. At night, around tamarisk fires that hissed like distant surf, Judah or Issachar would glance across the glow at Benjamin, face lantern-lit, and feel again the ghost weight of Joseph's coat stained with a kid's blood. No one spoke it aloud. Around the same embers Jacob, sight renewed but rheumy with age, traced the air with trembling fingertips, sketching constellations his eyes could no longer see clearly, murmuring snippets of revelation. My Lord never neglects his promise. The words settled like dew on restless suns. Days later the frontier appeared, a row of acacia poles topped with copper discs that flashed midday sun back into the traveler's gaze. Egyptian sentries and polished corselets bowed as the procession approached, but it was the banners behind them that drew gasps. Indigo sashes embroidered with a single white feather, Yusuf's personal insignia. The old shepherd felt his chest tighten, unsure whether it was excitement or the cumulative grief of years tearing like stitched cloth. Benjamin pressed beside him, steadying the patriarch's elbow. Trumpets unfurled a brassy ribbon of welcome, and suddenly courtiers in linen the color of ground almonds surrounded the family with trays of pomegranate juice thick as melted rubies. Escort merged with caravan. The road widened, paved now with limestone that kept the wagon wheels from biting dust. Fish-shaped standards bearing Pharaoh's cartouche swung overhead, but interlaced with royal iconography were verses in slanted Kufic script painted onto cedar panels. So verily, with every hardship comes ease. Some priests had protested the foreign syllables blooming on national processions, deeming them an intrusion. Yet Yusuf insisted that policy without reminder of its moral vector eventually calcifies into oppression. He knew the temptation personally. Power is a silent river pulling even strong swimmers off course, so he seeded the floodplain of statecraft with Quranic buoys. By the time the palm groves of avarice rose into view, dusk was smearing the sky with copper rose hues. The entire outer court of the administrative complex flickered with oil lamps, each one set upon a dish of Nile clay shaped by prisoners whose sentences had shifted from punitive to reparative under Yusuf's reforms. Gates opened, revealing a corridor carpeted with woven rushes. At its far throat Yusuf waited, neither regal nor servile, dressed in unadorned flax, sandals powdered by the day's papers he'd paced through, allocation charts, refugee petitions, treaties quavering on the hinge of signature. Seeing the silhouette of a bent old man push through the gauntlet of torchlight, he felt his ribcage dilate painfully, the body's futile attempt to accommodate an emotion more voluminous than flesh. He walked, no, ran, the way a child outruns protocol, and when Jacob recognized the cadence of those footfalls, his knees folded. Two lives collided, timelines meshed, and palace marble tasted shepherd's tears. No witness could later describe the embrace without their own voice catching. Some said the air itself brightened, as though each tear were a prism. Yusuf pressed his father's head to his chest, whispering the words he'd rehearsed against prison walls. This is the accounting of my Lord's kindness. He brought me out of the pit and you out of the wilderness. Jacob replied with psalmic brevity of the Qur'an. Indeed, my sustainer is subtle in what he wills. Around them the court inhaled reverence, an architecture of breath suspended in unity. Ceremony wove itself afterward. Audiences with Pharaoh where silver-bearded Jacob blessed a monarch in the name of the one beyond idols. Registries updated to allocate Goshen's lush pasture lands as familial estates. Wagons unloaded to reveal woven Canaanite blankets still smelling of thyme and wild goat. Policy took on the warmth of biography. Overseeing resettlement, Yusuf ensured each widow received an orchard share, each orphan a stipend from grain revenues. Egyptian administrators found themselves quoting lines of Surah 12 in scribal margins, we raise in degrees whom we will, half out of piety, half from practical observation that those verses now undergirded daily bread. Not everyone applauded. In the shadowed alcoves of the priestly library, where papyrus scrolls smelled of mold and incense, High Scribe Anksa and the Vizier of Granary Affairs plotted to reclaim influence. They argued Yusuf's bilingual decrees diluted Ma'at, the cosmic order. Whispers wound through temple corridors, suggesting the foreign counselor hoarded grain to purchase loyalties. Yusuf heard the rumors the way a sailor listens to the creak of mast ropes, signals of tension, neither to ignore nor overamplify. Experience had taught him that slander, like famine, thrives in vacuum. Transparency is answer. So he ordered public ledgers hung outside storehouses, carved on cedar panels tall as men, listing intake, distribution, remaining volume, mathematics that even illiterate eyes could see in notches and pictograms. Parents lifted children to touch the grooves. That is tonight's bread. Anxai's faction found defamation slippery on such surfaces. Famine deepened its long shadow. Caravans from farther horizons, Libu nomads, Hittite merchants, even Nubian scouts, now queued at the Delta's customs port, each requesting grain at scaled tariffs tied to distance traveled and destitution proven. A visiting scholar from Ugarit recorded awe at storehouses humming like hives yet governed by a poetry of fairness. The scholar failed to see the sleepless labor behind that poetry. Yusuf cross-checking night shipments, recalculating water rations, counseling overseers who suffered moral vertigo administering scarcity. He met each dawn with sajda prayer upon his tower's flat roof, forehead against reed mat, reciting, "My success is only by Allah." Policy flowed from that posture the way a river flows from mountain snowmelt. Organically, irresistibly. Inside the family compound, however, governance melted into more delicate weather. Forgiveness, once declared, still needed cultivation. Around evening stews of lentils and leeks, the brothers found themselves negotiating new speech, how to address the man they'd once sold. Reuben stopped mid-sentence sometimes, trapped between the honorific, "my lord," and the intimate "Aki," "my brother." Yusuf dismantled such awkwardness with jokes about childhood, evoking memories that felt like bandages being removed to reveal healthy skin beneath. Benjamin, no longer the youngest by demeanor, became unofficial envoy between generations, translating father's idioms into bureaucratic shorthand and brother's guilt into self-deprecating tales that coaxed Jacob's rare laughter. But night has a way of pressing cheeks against window lattices, peering at secrets daylight overlooks. Yusuf's dreams returned, different now from those prison riddles, visions of riverbanks lined with tombs, of statues eroded into eyelessness, of ledger sheets blanking themselves as though grain could vanish with ink. He prayed for clarity and received only the admonition that clarity, too, can be withheld to test trust. So he fortified storehouses anew, negotiated fresh caravan treaties with desert tribes who could escort convoys across bandit-swarmed wadis. And still the famine prowled, its lean years tallying 5 of the prophesied 7. And the 6th-year drought pressed hardest. The Nile's second flood failed entirely, a papyrus shadow on stone quays where watermarks recorded centuries. Priesthoods performed processions, idols ferried on barks afloat on manufactured canals, chanted hymns thick with desperation. Yet the granaries held, release schedules thinned but never stopped. A scribe tallied that not one infant died of bread shortage inside Egypt's borders that year, though across Canaan skeletal cattle collapsed like tents in wind. Diplomats brandished that statistic at foreign courts as proof of Pharaoh's divine favor, but Yusuf corrected them. Divine mercy, not favor. Favor implies exclusivity. Mercy spills over edges. Still, the eddies of envy swirling around court pillars gained speed. Anxai's cohort alleged the foreign creed eroded loyalty to Horus. They found a sympathetic ear in a young captain of Chariot Corps whose father had lost land grants under Yusuf's grain zoning. Papers were forged hinting that the Israelite clan, Jacob's people, were arming shepherd militias. One twilight, as date-front shadows lengthened into spears across courtyard tiles, the captain led a squad to search Goshen tents. He discovered only flocks, chipped lyres, and scrolls of genealogies extending back to Adam. But rumor needs no factual spine. It slithers boneless. Yusuf confronted the accusation before Pharaoh directly. Court protocol required elaborate bowing, but he approached like a doctor presenting lab results, calm, unhurried. He cited cargo manifests, militia registers, shepherd rod counts. Yes, even the number of slings the boys used to chase jackals, data cross-etched on ostraca with witnesses' seals. Then he recited the earlier dream prophecy, repeating how its fulfillment had sustained not merely Israel's clan but Egypt's entire breadbasket. Silence followed, thick as date syrup. Pharaoh's gaze swung from his chief advisor to the coterie of priests cloaked in incense ropes. A single edict quelled the tremor. The one who saved our children from hunger shall not be questioned by those who only save their own pride. Anxai was reassigned to an archive far upriver, where crocodiles outnumbered politics. That night Yusuf walked the palace roof again, a lantern in his left hand, the right smoothing the parapet's gritty sandstone. He remembered the deeper lesson of Surah Yusuf, that every valley of tribulation contains its paired summit, but one must walk with eyes on both. He penned a dispatch to outlying provinces instructing them to prepare for flood's eventual return, to dredge canals clogged with silt, to sow barley immediately after the first good rain even if the seed stock seemed perilously low. Because faith is to plant a palm though doomsday be announced, he wrote, a hadith his mother had murmured while braiding his hair long ago. He sealed the directive with green wax bearing the feather emblem and beneath it etched Bismillah in microcalligraphy, so tiny only the wax knew. Year 7 dawned with clouds bruised purple over elephantine. When thunder cracked, children in Goshen screamed then laughed, astonished by a sound most had never heard. Rain tattooed the granary roofs, plinked into cisterns bone dry for half a decade, dissolved dust off palm bark revealing hidden jade underground. Courtiers dashed into corridors holding copper bowls to catch the miracle, as though they could ladle mercy itself. Yusuf stood alone beside a column, palms open to sky, letting droplets patter onto his face unmediated. In that water he tasted every cell of past anguish, the cistern's damp stone, the prison's sewage stink, the metallic tang of shackles, the salt of homesick tears. And just beneath all that, sweeter than first-pressed date honey, the flavor of sabr, the Qur'an's sturdy patience, now ripened into fruition. Reclamation became the new arithmetic. Silt-rich runoff demanded hurried seeding. Yusuf supervised allocation of draft oxen, rotating them between districts like chess pieces protecting a vulnerable queen, soil, the true monarch. Schools he had founded in famine to teach record-keeping shifted curricula overnight to agronomy. How to read cloud patterns, when to flood rice paddies, why lentils restore nitrogen. Children who had survived on half rations now learned how to prevent recurrence. And woven through every lesson was the remembered axiom, God changes not the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves. One warm evening, with jasmine mist breathing from garden ponds, Jacob summoned his sons to his chamber. As lamps threw soft halos, he reminded them of Joseph's first dream, 11 stars, the sun, and the moon bowing. Tonight, he whispered, I feel the dream complete. They protested. Where was celestial choreography in this modest room of cedar beams? But Jacob gestured. Yusuf beside him like a rising star of governance, Benjamin glowing modestly, the brothers arrayed in a curve, and the old patriarch himself, reflective as a moon. They understood, and gratitude forced their foreheads to the carpet, not in obeisance to brother but in recognition of the architect behind every orbit. Tears darkened the weave. Angels, it is said, recorded that moment in inks invisible to mortal spectrum. Outside, reeds in the marshes rustled with nesting herons. Grain heads stirred in embryonic fields. Egypt inhaled a sin it had nearly forgotten. Plenty. But abundance can intoxicate. Yusuf knew the next labor was to anchor prosperity in righteousness before complacency began its stealthy erasure. He drafted an ethics charter for tax assessors, instituted sabbatical cycles for land to rest, set aside public funds for a library where scrolls from Mesopotamia to Minoan Crete would ferment ideas. In the charter's prologue he quoted himself quoting scripture, wealth is not volume of goods but depth of gratitude. Scribes blinked at the line yet copied it faithfully. Some years later children would chant it as a rhyme while skipping rope beside harvest wagons. As the season of first flood neared, Yusuf climbed once more to his tower roof at dawn. The horizon blushed gold, as though the sun rose embarrassed by its own beauty. He thought of his earlier letter to his younger self, and, inspired, wrote another, this one to the distant reader of history. In it he spoke of cycles, pits and pinnacles, hatred and healing, famine and feast, each twin like lungs drawing the same breath. He urged the reader to remember that Islam means surrender not of will but of fear, that the Qur'an is both cautionary flame and sheltering shade, that every story whispered by time exists so someone in the future might choose courage over convenience. He ended the letter with a line shaped like a doorway, and if you inherit ease, spend it as if you had tasted hunger yesterday. He tucked the parchment beneath a roof tile where rain had not reached, trusting wind or archaeology to decide its fate. Below, the city stirred, the clatter of bakers shifting ovens, grooms splashing horses, scribes yawning ink into quills. Somewhere a child born during the famine now giggled at raindrops, unaware his laugh was a census entry in the ledger of divine promise. Yusuf smiled, stretching arms wide as if to hug the horizon itself, and whispered the verse that threaded his life like a river through rock. My Lord is gentle to whom he wills. Indeed, he is the all-knowing, the all-wise. The words rose, mingling with dawn breeze, and drifted east toward fields just beginning to blush green, as though the earth itself were lifting a prayer in reply. The season of amethyst sunsets, When the Nile loosens from flood green into mirror silver, came to be called the years of quiet wheat. Not because the granaries stood idle, but because abundance finally felt ordinary. Silence returned to the threshing floors the way peace returns to a battlefield after even memory has tired of recounting names. Yusuf moved through these years as one might walk through an orchard he himself had grafted, checking the branches more by habit than anxiety, pruning here, propping there. Yet pausing often simply to inhale the fragrance of fruit that once existed only in the mathematics of vision. He was 40 by the new scribe's tally, though palace rumor insisted clarity of purpose preserved him younger. In truth, the beard that prisoners remember jet black had faded at the edges like parchment kissed too often by lamplight, but the eyes retained their crystalline steadiness, those wells that had once mirrored a pit square of sky and learned to drink patience from it. At dawn he still bowed upon the roof, and at dusk he still knelt upon packed earth, but somewhere between those devotions he felt a new tug, legacy. Not the brassy aftertaste of monuments or hieroglyphs hammered into quartzite, but the subtler imprint a policy leaves on unborn citizens, the way a lullaby sung tonight might ripple in the temperament of a grandchild yet unconceived. He convened a council of scribes, astronomers, midwives, and elders from both Nile and Goshen to draft what he called the Scroll of Succession, lines of civic apprenticeship so transparent they could outlive any single minister. The preamble quoted the same Quranic verse that had guided the ration ledgers. Then when the righteous take charge of the earth, they establish balance. One priest objected that the phrase was foreign. Yusuf smiled and asked, "Since when does balance speak only one language?" The objection collapsed like a tired mule. He paired each governor with a counterpart from Yaqub's clan. A weaver of camel wool might shadow a census official. A shepherd girl with quick arithmetic was apprenticed to canal engineering. Some Egyptians bristled, others shrugged. Bread erodes prejudice more slowly than famine does. But still it erodes, and within a season the novelty faded into routine. Markets began to smell of cumin and coriander in equal measure. Lullabies braided Canaanite pentatonic hums with Memphite drum patterns. Children drew cranes and ibises in the margins of Hebrew abecedaries, unaware they were sketching diplomacy. When an envoy from Byblos arrived to barter cedar, he laughed that he could no longer tell where Pharaoh's realm ended and Jacob's tribe began. Yusuf answered, "Perhaps where justice pauses, their borders emerge." Yaqub, meanwhile, ripened into the quiet translucence that sometimes graces prophets before death. His once mountain-loud voice had thinned to reed whisper, yet each syllable carried a shepherd's conviction. On cool nights he asked to be wheeled beneath date palms so he could taste the breeze unfiltered by palace perfume. There he told his grandchildren stories bound by a single refrain, "We belong to one who turns grief into lanterns." They plucked that phrase like grapes off a trellis, rolling it over their tongues until it tasted of bedtime safety. Yusuf visited nightly, reading to him the latest entries of the Scroll of Succession. Sometimes the old patriarch approved with a nod, sometimes he drifted to sleep mid-sentence, and Yusuf closed the papyrus without finishing, content to let dreams absorb the rest. It was during such a reading that Yaqub's breathing stuttered. No alarm, merely a slight hesitation, as though spirit and body were renegotiating tenancy. He opened his clouding eyes and gestured for his sons. They gathered, 11 shadows spilling across alabaster floor, the youngest 3 still smelling of marsh grass from an earlier game beside irrigation ditches. Yaqub had them recite, each in turn, their names and the name of the one they served. When they finished, he pressed Yusuf's wrist. "Bury me with my forefathers, in the cave that stands across from Mamre's oaks." Pharaoh later offered the red granite crypt reserved for viziers. Yusuf declined gently. Legacy, he knew, anchors in soil before it soars in marble. The funeral procession that wove from Egypt to Canaan resembled a human river bordered by 2 nations' grief. Egyptian charioteers escorted shepherd carts. Canaanite flutes piped hymns that entwined with Nilotic trumpets. On the 7th evening they reached the hill country where the cave of Machpelah yawned cool as mercy. Yusuf's brothers marveled at how seamlessly the pietistic rites braided, Egyptian chant rising like incense, Hebrew supplication descending like dew, Islam's invocation of Bismillah threading them both. Even Reuben muttered through tears, perhaps God wrote these languages only to find harmony in their overlap. After interment, the caravan traced its steps home. Yet home had subtly shifted. Phantom lines of authority blurred now that the patriarch no longer mediated. Around the communal bread tray the brothers reverted, for a moment, to the cadence of earlier guilt, shoulders hunched, glances measuring Yusuf's expression the way merchants weigh ore. Benjamin felt the room's temperature cool and intervened with a joke about how Pharaoh's scribes mispronounced Hebrew gutturals. Laughter thawed the moment, but not entirely. That night Judah and Zebulun approached Yusuf privately, offering themselves as lifelong servants if he would promise no hidden vengeance. Yusuf answered with the same astonished tenderness he'd shown at his reveal. Do you suppose I keep a second ledger of the heart, one that subtracts forgiveness at leisure? I fear the Lord of the worlds too much to reopen what he has closed. He quoted once more their shared scripture, Today no blame upon you, and Judah wept as though hearing it for the first time. After Jacob's burial, Egypt entered an era later poets would call the Bronze Lullaby. Floods arrived on schedule, taxes on grain were light, and the western deserts yielded new turquoise seams previously overlooked. With famine's memory receding, leisure sought entertainment. Amphitheaters staged epics, scribes composed odysseys about falcon-headed demigods who courted star maidens. Yusuf sanctioned the arts but insisted palace patronage include translations of foreign proverbs, among them the hadith of palm planting even on doomsday. At first audiences laughed at the parable's paradox, then an artisans' guild adopted it as motto, engraving tiny palm icons on copper mirrors exported upriver. Pharaoh teased that soon Yusuf's religion would be minted on coin. Better on conduct than coin, Yusuf replied, though he secretly arranged that the new Tinderham piece depict a sheaf of wheat flanked by a feather, justice cradling provender. Yet justice, like grain, attracts pests. Anksa's replacement in the archive, a minor bureaucrat named Hori, discovered a loophole in the water tithe system and began siphoning canal fees into private estates. Within a year, entire fishing villages found their access restricted by sudden tolls. Mothers trekked extra miles past watchtowers to fetch buckets now tinged with the taste of extortion. Complaints drifted up bureaucracy's ladder like paper kites falling instead of rising, until one kite snagged on Yusuf's parapet. He dispatched inspectors incognito, disguised as spice traders. They returned with wax tablets etched in trembling hands attesting to bribes, lashings, even false imprisonments for unpaid tolls. The evidence scalded Yusuf's composure. In council he read each testimony aloud, letting the words crack against alabaster columns. Hori was summoned, confronted, and offered the legal mercy of restitution. He scoffed, arguing that his actions upheld the market's invisible hand. Yusuf answered, invisible until it chokes the widow. A panel of judges, 2 Egyptian, 1 Israelite, sentenced Hori to labor dredging the very canals he had throttled. When some protested the humiliation, Yusuf cited Qur'an. As for the ship, it belonged to the poor who worked the sea. I wish to damage it so the tyrant should not seize it. The metaphor thundered. The verdict held. Such episodes convinced many that Yusuf's error was self-correcting, but he felt each corruption flare like a nerve pain beneath skin. He expanded the network of traveling accountants, nicknamed featherquills, whose sole task was to render invisible inequities visible by ink. Some nights he sat with them around oil lamps mapping complaints onto linen sheets that resembled constellations of suffering. Over time those constellations shifted, dots thinned, lines broke. Progress, he realized, was less like sunrise and more like tilting a heavy mirror. You reorient until enough light reaches a darkened room. Personal life, if it can be disentangled from such governance, matured quietly. Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, kept a garden behind the palace where figs swelled so sweet travelers claimed the fruit must sip honeysuckle dew at dawn. She and Yusuf often walked there after far prayer, discussing the latest papyrus on astronomy or whether mercy could be taught like arithmetic. Their sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, now lanky adolescents, split chores. One studied star charts with Memphite priests, the other apprenticed with shepherd uncles in Goshen, learning which bleat meant birthing trouble. Yusuf encouraged both tracks, sky and soil, abstraction and intimacy, believing truth stretches between them like a bowstring. It was Ephraim who first noticed his father's sporadic winces. At council Yusuf would shift, pressing a palm to lower ribs. Intercepted glances promised secrecy, yet rumors leak quicker inside palaces than water through reeds. A healer trained in Thebes herbs diagnosed a persistent stone near the kidney and prescribed infusions of ground lotus root blended with honey. Yusuf complied, but pain visited unpredictably, flaring like a reminder that even ministers cannot negotiate with mortality. His nightly prayers lengthened. The feather emblem upon his ring felt heavier, as if the symbol now carried gravitas rather than momentum. One amber evening, while reviewing canal maps, Yusuf felt a wave of dizziness and set the stylus down. He stepped onto the balcony. Below, lanterns bobbed on boats nudging riverbanks, a necklace of light strung over dark water. He remembered another river once glimpsed while cart-bound to slavery, the Jordan glinting between olive groves. How far he had traveled from that boy to this man poised between governance and goodbye. He whispered the verse that had escorted him across every threshold, and to Allah belonged the finest endings. His breath steadied. The next morning he summoned Ephraim and Manasseh, entrusted them with separate legacies. To the elder he gave the scroll of succession, to the younger he gave the shepherd's staff once carved by Jacob. Hold them as one holds a compass, he said, split in design yet unified in direction. He called Benjamin, appointing him liaison between Goshen and the treasury, an office that required both candor and humor, qualities Benjamin harvested effortlessly. Finally, he requested an audience of Pharaoh. The monarch arrived flanked by 2 panther-plumed guards, but dismissed them before greetings were over. He studied Yusuf's pallor, unmasked concern flickering behind kohl-rimmed lids. Yusuf smiled, a gentle tilt acknowledging shared history, dreams decoded, kingdoms fed, pride humbled. He presented a parchment, a decree transferring absolute stewardship of grain and canal to a tripartite council, Egyptian, Israelite, and Nubian, effective immediately upon his death. Pharaoh frowned at the word death. Ministers rarely speak it plain. Yusuf quoted the book he loved. Every soul shall taste it. The king sighed, signed, clasped the vizier's forearms with affection, and left without ceremony, the first time he had ever exited Yusuf's chamber without a retinue. Weeks folded into each other. The healer's tinctures dulled the stone's fury but thinned Yusuf's energy. He continued to labor, albeit seated, dispatching feather quills like swallows from a nesting cliff. On a night swollen with the sin of lotus, he dreamed once more. 11 stars bowed, but this time they rose and scattered into the shape of a boat, slipping across a cosmic river toward a horizon bright with unnameable color. He awoke smiling. Even farewell, it seemed, obeyed poetic recursion. He asked to be carried at dawn to the granary tower. Benjamin and Ephraim bore the litter, a Senath walking alongside, whispering Quranic invocations that braided petition with acceptance. At the tower's summit, Yusuf dismissed all but closest kin and let the sunrise bathe his face. Fields shimmered below, quadrangle canals reflecting gold. He pointed. There, where barley meets river, sow pomegranate trees. When famine comes again, fruit will remind people of spring. He recited the prayer of closure. Creator, you sufficed me before any needed me. Suffice them now without me. A breath, another, then stillness so profound even the wind hesitated. Word traveled, first a murmur among guards, then a lament carried by barges up and down the Nile. Pharaoh ordered 2 days of public silence. No market criers, no temple trumpets, only the rhythm of river against quay. On the 3rd day, a funeral cortege left the palace bearing not a sarcophagus but a simple cedar bier. It paused beside every granary Yusuf had built. At each stop, workers poured a basket of wheat onto the road, symbol that the dead vizier still fed the living. Birds descended in jubilant clouds, feasting, wheeling upward as if escorting the soul skyward. Burial followed his instructions, to rest beside Jacob someday, but first to lie temporarily near the river he had learned to read like scripture. His sons placed the feather ring into a niche carved at headstone base, the scroll into a sealed jar for the council's archive. Benjamin whispered a final jest, something about dreams being Pharaoh's preferred foreign policy, and wiped tears before anyone could tease him. Years later, travelers would note that Egypt's prosperity continued a generation after the vizier's passing. Canals gleamed, taxes stayed tempered, foreigners found fair weighing in markets. Some credited the tripartite council, others the momentum of surplus. But elders would shake their heads, tracing in dust the shape of a feather, and answer, balance does not perpetuate itself, it remembers. Then they would recite the verse etched on every granary lintel, and Allah is the best of planners. Thus legacy sifted forward, not as echo but as grain, nourishing those who never knew the name Joseph, yet still broke bread beneath the wings of his old, feather-shaped mercy. Wind remembers what stone forgets. Long after Yusuf's cedar bier was lowered into the Nile-side vault and the granary lintels cooled under uncounted moons, the prevailing breeze still combed the delta reeds with a faint hiss that old ferrymen swore echoed the rustle of his feather emblem. Commerce shifted, dynasties tilted, and children who had never tasted famine poured grain from baskets that bore his name the way skin bears a birthmark, unexamined, taken for granted, yet impossible to scrub away. In the scroll house of the tripartite council, a single lamp burned each night beside the jar that held the scroll of succession, its wax seal unbroken since the day Ephraim filed it among treaties and water rights. The guard on duty would sometimes fall asleep, but the flame rarely died. Oil funding was the one budget line no treasurer dared trim, Because someone always quoted the verse inscribed along the lamp's bronze collar. Allah does not allow the reward of the doers of good to be lost. Ephraim aged into the first chair of that council, his handwriting narrowing with each year until auditors joked he could squeeze a ledger's worth of accuracy into a thumbnail. His brother Manasseh tracked equinoxes and canal silt with equal devotion, charting them on papyri so crisp priests accused him of sorcery when the flood crest arrived within a stride of his prediction. Benjamin, gray now, laughter mellowed like late harvest wine, operated as the humor valve inside government, walking between Nile bureaucracy and Goshen pastures to bleed off tension before it calcified. Their children intermarried with both Egyptian artisans and shepherd cousins, drawing mixed bloodlines that looked, at festival time, like tapestry threads braided by a single invisible loom. Memory calcifies, too, but at a pace so slow no living ribcage can feel the weight. 30 years after Yusuf's death, a new pharaoh, Jedhotep, ascended. He was neither cruel nor ignorant. He simply counted ancestors differently, tallying lineage by war trophies rather than granary walls. During his first audience with the council, he examined the feather seal on Ephraim's signet and remarked, "The emblem is elegant, but perhaps dated." Ephraim smiled, answering that grains still bowed beneath that feather. Jedhotep nodded politely. Policy deferred to nostalgia when it cost little, and nothing changed, yet the remark lingered like iron in sweet water. The drift, subtle at first, manifested in titles. Egyptian scribes began to record the Israelite shepherds as Habaru, a word that once meant traverser of borders, but now curdled to suggest outsider. Canal tolls, waived since Yusuf's reforms, reappeared for caravans bearing goatskins instead of copper ingots. Feather quill inspectors flagged the irregularities, but the new vizier, a courtier named Satep, filed their complaints under seasonal adjustments. He argued that loyalty expressed in wheat should now be proven in brick. Egypt planned a temple city upriver, and free labor would demonstrate civic unity. Benjamin attended the decree's proclamation, leaning on Jacob's old staff for support. He watched as levy papers, each stamped with the same falcon-headed glyph, fluttered across the marble like startled doves. That night he wrote to Ephraim, "The wind shifts. We must tether remembrance lest it sails beyond reach." Ephraim read the note, sealed it into the archive, and doubled the lamp oil. Years sluiced by. Brick quotas climbed. Levy camps spread along clay pits where whipgrass whipped even on windless days. Some Israelis signed willingly. Work was work, and after all the state still honored Joseph's tax caps. Others muttered that straw now cost coin. In council sessions, Ephraim lobbied for grain subsidies to offset the burden. Satep countered with diagrams of treasuries bending under festival expenses. When Ephraim cited the Quranic ethic of surplus shared, Satep replied that the Qur'an, though venerable, was not included in the latest palace syllabus on imperial cults. No outrage surfaced, only the cold hush of bureaucracy closing a door. Every night Ephraim walked the granary district, noting feed levels, interviewing widows queued for allotments. One dusk he saw a boy slip beneath the storehouse awning, fingers trembling as he scooped a palmful of spelt from a leaky burlap seam. The boy's ribs ridged through skin. Ephraim let him run unchallenged, then traced the broken stitch with callous thumb. He whispered the verse Yusuf had quoted on governance. Balance must be established, and realized balance tips not by earthquake, but by 1,000 spilled grains. At 57, Ephraim delivered his final address to council, a meticulous bar graph drawn in charcoal showing brick output rising, grain access sinking, and infant mortality edging upward like a stealthy viper. His closing argument was a question: what is a monument if those who build it crumble? Satep applauded the poetic concern and filed the chart. The following spring, the lamp beside the scroll burned lower. Oil shipments were reprioritized. Legacy, however, had layered redundancies. 2 generations of schoolchildren had recited Yusuf's market maxims. Some now served as junior scribes. One, a curly-haired woman named Neferu, inked her reed pen in silent rebellion and began copying the scroll of succession by stealth, 1 clause per night, onto scraps. She smuggled them to a network of apprentices who built an illegal ledger. Yusuf's constitutional DNA inserted into fresh amanuenses. They dubbed themselves the listeners, a nod to the Quran's command. So give good news to those who listen. The movement vibrated beneath official notice like bees inside wall crevices. Benjamin did not live to see their work reach quorum. On his 70th birthday, he collapsed while adjudicating a pasture dispute. As he lay under tamarisk shade, he joked, "Tell my brother I've outrun him at last," then folded into stillness. Goshen mourned with flute dirges that rose like reeds in wind, but Memphis kept its tempo. Brick quotas did not pause for grief. Ephraim traveled upriver to bury the staff beside Benjamin's cloak in a hill grave overlooking both pasture and palace roofs, a vantage point his brother would have appreciated. Meanwhile, Jedhotep's son, Amosi, inherited the throne with ambitions shaped by architects hungry for more than one temple city. Labor edicts tightened. Rations switched from balanced grains to a thin gruel. Israelite complaints met stone ears. Some families decamped deeper into delta marshlands, resurrecting tents like ancestral echoes. There, children learned old lullabies about a dreamer vizier who counted famine among God's disguises of mercy. They learned, too, hush songs about another prophecy. This one only half remembered, speaking of a liberator yet to come, a baby drawn from water. The listeners took note. They mapped where infants were born, where levees hit hardest, how rumor morphed into expectation. In one reed roof hut, a midwife whispered to a newborn's startled mother, "Call him Musa, for he was drawn forth." The mother blinked. Why speak of drawing? But the midwife only smiled, hearing distant waves inside prophecy's shell. Outside, frogs croaked, a common delta chorus, yet in some ears it rang like the first drumbeat of coming plagues. Ephraim, white-bearded, sensed the shift in air the way sailors smell storm long before clouds mass. Too old to trek muddy streets nightly, he convened the surviving feather quills. By oil light, they pored over smuggled levy lists, marking in red the villages where straw was withheld. The pattern formed claws closing around Goshen. Ephraim exhaled. "So Joseph's warehouse," he murmured, "has become Pharaoh's foundry." He dictated a circular codex, equal parts memoir and manifesto, weaving Quranic exhortations into logistic counsel. How to hide grain in clay jars, how to share stingily so hoards escape detection, how to whisper courage in children's ears though tongues crack with thirst. He titled it Book of the Threshold and sent the listeners scattering with copies tucked under shawls. Not all Egyptians applauded the tightening yoke. Riverport merchants grumbled that levee routes delayed timber shipments. Mid-rank soldiers disliked policing hungry crowds. One young architect scribbled a marginalia beside his temple blueprint. "Stone praises gods. Living hearts do better." The empire remained mighty, but hairline fissures creeped across its moral limestone. Amosi, noting production lag, issued a decree. Any Israelite male child born henceforth would be inspected for economic viability. The phrase, more chilling than a whip crack, spread on papyrus orders delivered by night. Mothers birthed babies in marsh huts, soundproofed by rush walls and the croak of ibis. Fathers learned the art of footstep listening, distinguishing friend from assessor in the rustle of reeds. Some infants still vanished, slipped into levee camps, or worse, but others survived, hidden in baskets smeared with pitch. The feather emblem, once stamped on legal grain vouchers, now reappeared scratched onto those baskets. A code of remembrance floating down dark canals toward improbable rescue. One humid dawn, as mist hugged the water like a shawl, Neferu watched a basket drift, guided by unseen hands. She whispered the opening verse of Surah 12, Aleph Lam Ra. These are the verses of the clear book, because clarity, she had learned, was often a tide disguised as uncertainty. She could not know that the infant inside would one day demand Pharaoh unhand an entire people. She could know only that rivers sometimes courier the future in reed-woven cradles. Ephraim died that same summer, seated at his desk, stylus midward. The unfinished sentence read, "Exile begins in the heart before it crosses a border." Listeners buried him beside the granary wall, tucking the stylus into his folded hands. They took the unfinished tablet as omen rather than defeat. Under moonlight, they copied the phrase onto scraps and passed them like flint between stone fingers, striking sparks in darkness. Years folded like papyrus in a humid archive, and the monarchy forgot Joseph altogether. Pharaoh's officials argued about supply chains, never about mercy. But wind still threaded the delta reeds with that faint shss. Children asked elders what sound it was, and elders told of a man who deciphered dreams, then built silos large enough to store not just grain but gratitude. Some youths scoffed, old myths for hungry nights. Others listened and felt the feather rustle the pages of their own unhatched destinies. One starlit night, deep in the labor camp barracks, a teenager named Caleb turned to his bunkmate and murmured, "If the dreamer's God once filled barns against famine, why would he now ignore whips against our backs?" The bunkmate, a stonemason's son with palms blistered into maps of endurance, replied, "Perhaps he waits for us to become dreamers again." Outside, the overseer's torch sputtered, unwatched. The flame collapsed into glowing coal, and darkness rushed in like breath drawn before speech. Darkness is the Qur'an's favored canvas for revelation. Out of it once came verses that saved a kingdom from starvation. Out of it would soon come signs, blood water, locusts, staff-turned-serpent, that would pry open the tightest fist of tyranny. Yet between those celestial brushstrokes lay this interlude of forgetting and remembering, a quiet wheat turned to compulsory brick, an emblem fading on coin only to re-emerge on smuggled papyri and reed baskets. And through every oscillation, the whisper persisted, "Allah is the best of planners." That sentence outlived kings. It nested in granary lintels, in listeners' passwords, in lullabies smuggled across levee fences, until one dawn it would unfurl in thunderous imperative, "Let my people go." But that is another surah, another prophecy. For now the feather rests beneath Nile's silt, its bronze outline dulled but intact. Wind glides low, combing reeds, repeating the secret of continuity. Grain may rot, monuments may topple, but mercy, once planted, tends to reseed in unexpected furrows. And sometimes, when the river runs especially quiet, an oarsman, Egyptian by birth, Hebrew by sympathy, will stop mid-stroke because he thinks he hears footsteps on water, the sound of a prisoner long freed still patrolling the granary of human conscience. That sound does not come from memory alone. It is the echo of a verse turned living architecture, of Islam's reminder that history is neither spiral nor circle but helix, each twist revisiting old coordinates at higher elevation. In the next twist, a man named Musa will split the sea instead of the dream. Still, he will carry Yusuf's ledger in the double helix of heritage, patience on one strand, justice on the other. And somewhere behind him, the wind will keep reciting, in the dialect only stone forgets, shss, the feather brushing the threshold between despair and deliverance.